Hello. So now you're ready to bind your quilt. How exciting is that? You've got it all pieced, appliqued, whatever it is you're doing, you've got it all quilted, and now you're ready to bind it. Well, this is a great place to be with quilting, to be ready to bind a quilt because you know it's nearly done. So I've got a quilt here that's nearly done, and I've actually already trimmed off 3 of the sides, but I've left one so I can show you how I trim my quilts. So usually your backing and batting are a little bit bigger than your quilt when you're quilting, and I've done all this on my domestic machine. If you're having a quilt quilted on a long arm machine, you've often got a little bit more even than that because they need it for the machines. But so I'm all ready here to trim this, and I usually use my rotary cutter and ruler to trim my quilts with. And I'm just going to line that up with a straight an edge as I can get. If it's a little bit wonky, I kind of create a straight edge. And so I'm just laying it on my board and lining it up pretty much with the quilt. Everything's looking like it's fairly straight here, and I'm just going to trim that off through all the layers. I'm just trimming off the backing and any little scruffy bits on the side of the quilt. Slide it along and continue on in the same manner, and all the way to the end, and it's looking pretty good. And that wasn't hard, was it? There's my quilt trimmed already. And so now I'm ready to put some binding on. Now I'm going to machine my binding on. I've shown you in a previous video how to prepare the binding, and now I'm going to stitch it on. So I've got my prepared binding here. I've got this great length of binding. I've done diagonal joins in it, and because I'm going to machine it down, I'm not hand sewing at all. I'm going to actually sew it onto the back of the quilt and then roll it round and stitch it down by machine to the front of the quilt. So I'll show you how I do that. I'm going to start some sewing here on the back, and on my binding I've actually already pressed a fold in, so it was a straight edge at the end of my binding. I've clipped off the selvage that was there, and I've just folded that diagonally so that it's lined up and it's a nice sort of straight corner. And I'm going to stitch that onto my quilt here, and I'm just going to stitch a short distance to start with, just to cover where that fold comes over, and then I'm going to stop and I'll start again. And so I've got my binding the full width open at the moment. I haven't pressed it or anything. I will be folding it up shortly to use it. So I'll just show you how I get started with my binding. So I'm just laying it on, so I'm sewing onto the back of my quilt, just using my regular 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to sew down just past where that little folded bit is, and I'm going to take it out of the machine, and I'm going to fold over my binding now. Now I haven't pressed my binding. I like to do it this way with it open and just hold it with the raw edges together as I sew. Some people do prefer to press it first, and that's entirely up to you how you do that. This is just the way I do mine. So I've stitched just to this point here, and I'm now going to leave a gap of maybe 3 inches unstitched and start stitching again down here, again with the 1/4 inch seam, but I'm just going to leave that little bit open because when I come down I can tuck in the other end of my binding into there. So I'll just get this into the machine, and then we'll head towards a corner and I'll show you how I turn my corners. So I'm just going to lock that off a little bit. If you've got a needle down, it's often helpful because you've got quite a lot of bulk of quilt and it might just sort of slip around a little bit. And I'm just going, now when I do the binding, I'm not trying to pull the binding really taut or anything, and I don't want it to be too sloppy because your edges will go a little bit wavy, but I do add just a hint of tension, so just a little bit of pull on that, because when you've got a quilted thing which is kind of spongy and it's up and down a little bit, if you just let it sort of ride and sort of go with the ups and downs, it could possibly end up a little bit loose, which wouldn't give you a very nice edge. So just a tiny bit of tension on that binding, and then let that go through. So as I said, we're doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and right down, and you're going to stop a 1/4 inch before you get to the end. So that could be a little tricky. If you're not sure where 1/4 of an inch is, you might want to mark it with a pin. You want to be, so this is the end of your quilt here, and you want to stop 1/4 of an inch before you get to the end. So we want to stop about there. And we're going to lock it there. So a little reverse stitch would be helpful there. And then I'm going to take that, take that out of the machine, take my needle out, snip my threads, and now I'm going to turn the corner. So what I've got is this, and I've stopped that 1/4 of an inch before the end. So holding my raw edges together, I want to fold that so that I get this nice diagonal fold, so that the fold comes right out through the point of the quilt down to here, and it's straight back. So it's a right angle that you're going to form there. And then I'm going to fold it back, and I'm going to line that fold up with the very edge of the quilt. So you've got this nice little sort of sneaky corner tucked in there, and I'm going to start sewing right on the end and continue on down the next side. And what this does is allows you to have a nice little mitre when you fold the quilt binding over the quilt. It will automatically form a little mitre, which is a really nice way to do a corner. It doesn't round the corners off or anything like that. And you'll see how that works a bit later when I do the other part of the binding. So now I've just got to go all the way along this side, and then when I get to the next corner I'm going to take it out and do that little fold thing just the same on each of the corners. So I've just got to work my way around the quilt now. So I'm just coming down the last stretch of my quilt. I've been round, I've done all my little flip-flops at the corners. And I'll show you how I tuck that end in to the binding. Okay, so here I am. I'm back where I started with that little bit that I'd left open, and I've got my binding here, and I'm going to tuck it in. So that little bit that I'd left before the stitching starts, I'm going to trim my binding so that it fits within that space. So, but you want it to be well under where the little fold comes over. So take it down a reasonable distance, trim that off so that you can slide it in, and just stitch right on down. Tuck that binding piece inside there and bring this diagonally folded piece around. So you want to make sure that's all sitting nicely and snug, and just keep on sewing all the way down till you meet up with the sewing where you first started. So I can take that out of the machine now. So I've got that nicely folded little join there, which sits really nicely. If it's a problem to you sitting a little bit flapping like that, you can hand sew it down a bit later, but usually I don't have any problem with that. So now that I've finished putting the binding onto the back of the quilt, I can turn the quilt over and I can start sewing it down onto the front. So it's quite a large quilt, this one. And it doesn't really matter where I start and stop. So I've got the quilt on the back, and I'm going to fold that over and roll it now around to the front. And I'm going to stitch it down close to that folded edge on the binding, and that will give me a seam, because I cut it 2.5 inches wide. That will give me just a little tiny stitching line on the back. So you might want to colour match your thread to your fabric if you're going to do it this way. And the seam, little sewing line, will be just inside, but it actually doesn't really show on the quilt unless you go looking for it, of course, in which case you'll find it. So I'm just going to start sewing here. I'm going to do a little lock stitch to get started, and I'm going to put my needle down. If you've got a needle down position, it's really helpful. It's also helpful, I perhaps should have mentioned this earlier, to use your walking foot to put binding on, because you're working through something that's a little bit bulky and with the batting in. And I've got a little dual feed on my machine here, so that's really nice. So I'm just going to go along here to the corner, and I'll show you how to do the corners. So I'm just stitching quite close in to the edge of that binding. I'm just rolling it round as I go, keeping it as straight as you're able to. Now when I get to the corner, I'm not quite there, I'm nearly there. I'll just do this a little bit. So as I'm approaching the corner, I'm going to fold that so that it kind of comes up at an angle there. And as I get even closer, so this folded edge that you're sewing along should come straight down, and then you can, it's coming at an angle from the corner, and then you can flip that back up, and that causes a really nice mitre to form there. And so you can just stitch down to the corner now and pop your needle down into this little bit that we're going to turn the corner on, lift your foot and pivot with it in there. Now I usually, for no particularly good reason, do a little back stitch here just to make sure that it has caught all that corner up nicely. And here we go, my machine was having a little say-so of its own just there. And here we go. And I'm going to continue on round now. So each time I get to the corner, I'm going to keep the fold going straight down and then flip up the next bit. So I'm just coming up to another corner, so I'll just show you the corner again, in case you missed it last time. A bit tricky when you're on the machine and not the other end of the camera. So what I'm doing here is I'm folding that over. And as I get closer to the corner, I'm keeping that line going straight down there so that I've ended up with a little bit of an angle here. And as I'm coming even closer, I'm going to fold that over the bottom line in front of me now so that I get this nice little mitre forming here. And I'm going to stitch right the way down till I get onto the bit that I've just folded up, and then I'm going to pivot. So just come down here, stitch onto that new side, needle down, pivot it round in there, down, and usually I just do a little tiny back stitch here just to make sure, and then I go forward again and do the next side until I get to the next corner again. So I'm just coming down the last straight on the binding. What a good feeling. So I've been all the way round, mitered all those little corners, and nearly back to the beginning. And then I'll show you what it looks like. So here I'm going to join up. This is where I started. So that should all be sitting in nicely. And just do a little lock stitch, needle out, and that's another quilt finished. How exciting is that? So this is the join that I've done here. You can see that there's just a tiny little bit of a lift there, so you may just want to catch that in by hand if that's a problem to you. Very often I don't worry about that. It doesn't seem to change or exaggerate itself in any way. And I'll show you on the back of the quilt here, just inside the binding, there's a little line of sewing. I'm not sure if you can see that, but that's that little line that's created by stitching the binding down onto the front. So it's barely noticeable. Not something I ever worry about being there. And then this is the back of the corner. You can see we've got a nice little mitered fold in there. And if I just turn it over, hopefully you can see here that this is the front of the mitre. And again, I think that that's a very acceptable corner for quilts. This is how I do my quilts. This is not necessarily the right way. There's no right or wrong way in my opinion. I like to do my quilts like this. I don't enjoy the hand sewing part, so I have found a way to do it by machine, and I know a lot of other people do them by machine. It's a very practical, very strong way of binding your quilts. So that was just showing you how I do my bindings, and I hope that's helped. This is a fun looking quilt. I'm really pleased to have this one finished, and hopefully you'll enjoy doing some bindings that way too. Thank you.